Are you not sure what information you should be paying attention to know when the right time is to buy low or sell high on a player? In this video, I'm going to share what things you should be looking for to help identify these good buy low, sell high opportunities, and then give some practical tips that will help increase your odds of actually getting these trades to go through. When playing fantasy football, it can be easy to be just solely focused on the amount of fantasy points that a player is producing each week, while ignoring other important factors that are factoring into how they're getting those points or why they're getting those points. Now, don't get me wrong, it's important to understand how many points a player is getting, and at the end of the day, that's really what matters. But it's even more important to kind of have a deeper understanding as to how they're getting those points, so it's easier to predict how they'll perform in the future and if it's something that's actually sustainable. For example, there could be a running back who, let's say, scored a couple touchdowns on a given week, but when you look a little bit closer, maybe they weren't on the field all that much, or they really didn't even gain that many yards. And so the actual fantasy production of them that week is a little bit deceiving for what their actual value truly is and what it will be moving on into the future. Being able to successfully buy low and sell high in fantasy really comes down to being able to recognize those other factors that are impacting fantasy production that the common person isn't paying attention to or doesn't notice, and then taking advantage of that information and the current perception of a player to get the most value out of a trade. So what does it mean to buy low on a player, and how do you go about doing that? So buying low on a player is the idea that you trade for a player when their perceived value is at its lowest or lower than you predict it will be for the rest of the season, allowing you to acquire them at a lower price. Now, that might sound great and all, trying to buy somebody who is about to break out or who's cheaper than they will be later in the season. But the question is, how do you actually identify those players and what are you supposed to be looking for? The first thing that you should really be asking yourself is, why are they not performing? So really what you're doing here is you're kind of looking for reasons to justify why they're not playing well or why you expect them to play better later in the season. So one thing that you want to look at is, have they been playing in tough matchups? That is a huge reason why a lot of players either struggle or play well at times, and some fantasy owners might not realize that the reason for their poor performance was because of tough matchups, and the schedule might open up for them later on in the future or in the upcoming weeks, and that's an opportunity to really find somebody who's going to start improving. Is a player in a new offensive system, or are there new pieces to the offense that might just take a little bit more time to start clicking and getting in the flow? That can be a legitimate reason that can potentially start improving as the season goes on. A player also might be hampered by an injury. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. That doesn't mean you want to go after players that are dealing with injuries or are injury prone, but sometimes players are working themselves back to full strength and they can progressively get better week after week and get closer to 100%. Sometimes just the entire offense just has a fluky game or just isn't clicking for a week or two. Now, that's different than trying to get a player that's on a poor offense. Sometimes you just have to look deeper than the final numbers and see if there was a fluke game or it was a weird game script where you don't expect that to happen majority of the weeks. And then also another thing that's not going to show up in the score sheet, but if you're paying close enough attention or you watch highlights and you read a little deeper, the player that you're targeting may have just missed a few big opportunities that if they connected, their entire outlook would look completely different and their value would be much higher. Now, another question that you want to ask yourself is, what is their level of involvement in the offense? Now, is the reason they're struggling because they're not getting opportunities, or are they getting those opportunities and they're just not connecting on them yet? So some stats that you want to be looking at is snap count percentage. For wide receivers, how many targets are they getting per game? For running backs, how many total opportunities, so targets and rush attempts? And see if it's an issue of involvement or if they just haven't capitalized on those opportunities yet. Now let's take a look at selling high on a player and what that looks like. So selling high is when you trade a player who's providing fantasy production that you believe is unsustainable and that their value has peaked. And then what you do is you capitalize on their hot streak or a good game and get as much value as possible in return for that player. I'm gonna give you some examples of things that you should be looking for to help identify players that could potentially be good sell high candidates. One thing to take a look at, just like you would do when trying to buy low on a player, is the difficulty of players' matchups. Look to see if a player is putting up good points against legitimate defenses or if they're just taking advantage of easy matchups. If they've only been taking advantage of poor defenses and they have a difficult matchup coming up or a difficult stretch of matchups coming up, that may be a good time to take advantage of their value before that stretch of difficult matchups. Are there any players on your team who are scoring touchdowns at a rate that is unsustainable? Take advantage of some of those players whose value is at their highest and you don't predict that same outcome and same production throughout the rest of the season. Also, look to see if there are players on your roster who are reliant on 1 or 2 big plays a game to be productive in fantasy. When you have players who are reliant on those big plays and don't get a ton of volume and opportunity, their margin for error becomes so much smaller and more difficult to predict when they're gonna have a good fantasy outcome. Now, once you've identified some good sell high candidates on your team, here are a couple tips on how to successfully trade them to another team. Tip number 1 is that you want to look for teams that are desperate for the position that you are trying to sell. You want to be intentional about who you're actually offering these players to and bring it to their attention that you have something that they need. Other managers in your league aren't going to know that that particular player is available unless you let them know. So go to those teams that you think could use that player the most and then see where that leads you. Tip number 2 is to capitalize on big breakout games. I'm talking 2 touchdown plus games. These are the ones that stand out in people's minds and they remember. And so you want to capitalize on their perception when it's at its highest. And these blow-up games can be even more impactful when they're done on primetime games. So if one of your players breaks out on a primetime game, there are so many more eyeballs watching that game that other people maybe would have missed if it was in a regular slate on a Sunday. So take advantage of those games that everybody's kind of seeing and the buzz is at its highest. Now, make sure you avoid this mistake when you are trying to buy low and sell high. Do not simply buy low on a player that has a big name and is not performing well, or sell a player that is on a hot streak. You have to have legitimate reasons as to why you think a player is going to turn it around or start playing better than they have, or why you think a player's current production is higher than what you think it will be later on in the season. So don't just go into it too simple-minded, thinking, oh, this player isn't doing well, let me get them while they're cheap, without having a good reason as to why you think they'll actually be better later in the season. At the end of the day, this strategy involves a lot of predicting, so there's always a chance of being wrong. But if you're able to read between the lines and sell and buy at the right times, then this can really help give you an edge over your league mates. I hope you found this information helpful to help you win your trades in your league. If you found this useful, please subscribe below to get more.